Beautiful. Well, it looks like we're already recording. So I'm aware other people will keep dialing in, but we'll make a start. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second RR-CLaN session for 2025. The topic is from idea to measure. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. That feels like an absolute tongue twister. Thank you, Andrew. We have Professor Andrew Baillie with us today from Sydney Local Health District, who will be presenting. Can I get the next slide, please, Andrew? So before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we work and live. I'm coming to you today from Dharawal country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians' living culture, their connection to country, their contribution to the life of the regions we live in. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders of the region and to all Aboriginal people, past, present and future, plus any First Nations people joining us today. Next slide, please. We'd also like to say a big thank you to our sponsor for RR-CLaN, the University Centre for Rural Health in the Northern Rivers. They are supporting the delivery and operations of our RR-CLaN seminars. Next slide, please. So who are the RR-CLaN? We are a collaborative partnership across New South Wales and Queensland, and we are growing. So we have a number of local health districts and health services from New South Wales and Queensland across all the rural areas. So 10 New South Wales local health districts, the Health Education and Training Institute, HETI, New South Wales Ambulance, where I'm from, the Tropical Australian Academic Health Centre, and 8 Queensland Hospital and Health Services. Next slide, please. If, of course, you missed today's session, you can't stay, your colleagues can't make it, or you missed any of our previous ones, well, not to fear. We have a YouTube channel. You can find all of those recordings up on YouTube. Today's session is, of course, recorded, and all attendees will be sent a link to that. So please feel free to distribute that to your networks. Next slide, please. Some brief housekeeping. Of course, we are recording today. If you aren't comfortable with being recorded, please just keep your video off and you won't be able to be identified in the recording. We also ask that you keep yourself muted just because of the large numbers we are expecting today. Alex and I will be monitoring the chat for questions. So if you do have questions for Andrew, please just pop them in the chat. We will hopefully have some time at the end for a bit of Q&A where we will invite people to unmute themselves and ask some questions. So that takes me to the next slide, which is, having said all that, please do actually ask questions. We want you to be able to interact. Andrew has prepared a couple of interactive moments throughout this presentation, but please pop your answers in the chat. If we can answer it, we will. If it's something really pertinent, maybe we'll slightly not rudely interrupt Andrew if it's super duper important. Otherwise, we'll collate and curate these for the end. So I'll stop yapping soon, but the final bit of talking, please, if I could have the next slide. So this is Professor Andrew Baillie, and I won't try and present or repeat his title again because I'm sure I will get it wrong because it's a tongue twister. But Professor Andrew Baillie is a clinical psychologist and Professor of Allied Health within the Sydney Local Health District. He works in Sydney LHD to build allied health research capacity. He's also a senior advisor to the Sydney Health Partners Implementation Science Academy. His research collaborates with the Matilda Centre for Research in Substance Use and Mental Health, the Edith Collins Centre for Translational Research in Alcohol and Other Drugs and Toxicology, and he also works with Drug Health Services at RPA and the psychology team at RPA Virtual. He is, of course, eminently well qualified to talk to us today, so I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I guess here's my title slide, which has one of the beginnings of the joke. This is about choosing tools. And of course, one of the things that we're going to really come up with is this sort of collision between a sort of theoretical thing about what it is that we're trying to measure, and then actually we've got to come up with a really practical answer about which way we do it. So there's a QR code there if you want to use that QR code to get the slides, but also in the chat. And for those of you who maybe recently joined, I can paste that in again in case you don't see the link in the chat. There's a link to the PDF of these slides. If you want them now, there will be a way that you'll get them in the future as well. Okay, so I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands. I'm down here in Sydney on the Gadigal lands in the Great Eora Nation, and this image that you see there from Lee Hampton is a fantastic image that captures the Gadigal, Bedigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands I'm calling in today from. And just to keep the joke going about choosing the right tool, sometimes we choose a tool that is quite expedient. So I do like this kind of joke here. Please come loose, the little socket wrench. A bigger one, I hope it comes loose. A really large bar for a socket wrench, I wasn't asking. Then the angle grinder comes out to take the nut off. You should have listened. And then finally we go for the blowtorch. It can't be tight if it's liquid. So I guess that captures some aspect of what we want to talk about today, and that is we do need tools to do the job of research. We do need measurement tools, and we do have this kind of collision between some theoretical ideas and some really practical things to choose. How do we do that is part of what we're talking about today. Just to keep things going. Now, I know last time you met, you had Rebecca Venturuti talking about cause and effect and epidemiology, and she did talk about a number of key variables, exposure or risk factors and outcomes. These things are all measured, and we need to be able to pin them down and measure them. And she also talked about information bias and measurement error as part of what you need to consider in this. And I suppose the little image I have there is the billiard. Well, it's not billiards. It's pool, isn't it? With the cue ball as the exposure and cause. And we can imagine what happens when that exposure hits the. Oh. Okay, I'll keep going. And then next time round, you've got Steve Camper talking about asking the right questions. And a really good quote there from Einstein: if I had to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. So one of the things that we face in research is if we don't ask the right question, the answer we get might not be terribly useful. Today fits in between those two things, because today is about how do we define or pin down or operationalize or take these ideas and turn them into measures. Now, just a little bit about me. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've been a fairly standard academic. I worked in health services at the beginning of my career. I've done research on self-regulation. I spent a bit of time being a kind of nerdy psychometrics nut. I do clinical trials in anxiety and drinking, and I do translational research. About 10 years ago, I became a professor of allied health, and that really led me to think, well, what's the sort of brains trust that I will use in that space? And implementation science really became the kind of brains trust for my work. And so the work I do with Sydney Health Partners in the Implementation Science Academy is kind of a stimulus for, when the rubber hits the road, how do we make research actually work in health services to deliver better care and better outcomes for our communities? And there's a few logos of some of the teams I work with. This slide has most of the story. Again, there's a QR code for the slides. Really what I want to talk about today is, what are the frameworks we use to help us make these decisions, but the practical and theoretical balance when we're going to try to choose a tool. Really want to spend a bit of time thinking about the conceptual issues, because oftentimes we make mistakes because we don't really think through what it is we want to measure, the concept. Obviously, there's some technical features: the precision, the reliability, the validity, the accuracy, the responsiveness. Those factors, I think, are really at the center of what we want to talk about. And then some practical things. Lastly, how do you find this information? Because it's not in the same places as where you're used to finding information. And then how do you put it all together? And to keep my joke going, here's one of my favorite tools. This tool over here is a fro. It's a very obscure tool. It's a tool for making wooden shingles. I have one of these, but I've never used it. I'm not getting, I guess one of the things about giving presentations on Zoom is I don't get to hear the groans of the bad jokes. Okay.
We had someone laugh Andrew. Oh, two people.
That's good.
There we go.
Oh,
People
that's good.
reacting.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay. So you know, if I was trying to put all of what I wanted to talk about in one picture, it would be something like this. You know, if we think that the concept we're trying to measure, maybe someone needs to go on mute.
Sorry, Andrew. Yeah, can I just remind everyone, please keep yourselves on mute because it does interrupt the flow of the presentation. Thank you.
But as I say, this is sort of trying to say everything in one slide. Yeah, let's assume that the thing that we're trying to measure is the target. So we can be precise and we can be accurate. We can be reliable and we can be valid. And those two things represent different aspects of what we're talking about. So you can see the four sorts of combinations of things. We really want to be what's happening on the far right-hand side. I don't see my cursor very well, but we want to be reliable and valid. Sometimes we're not very reliable and we're not valid. Sometimes we're quite valid, but we're not very reliable. And sometimes we are reliable, but not very valid. One of the catch in doing this is that in this picture, you can see the target. Now, many times when we're trying to measure something we can't directly see. We don't have very good standards. In this example, we have the standard of the target against which to judge how accurate and how precise the tool that we're using is. Our challenge today is we're often talking about measurement. We don't know what the target is exactly. So we kind of have to try to understand this issue of validity or accuracy. And that is really about how well what we're using captures the concept, captures the idea that we're trying to work on, and then reliable or precise. And that really is the concept of how well does the thing that we're using give us predictable, consistent kind of answers. So those are the kind of two issues. That's kind of really all of what I wanted to say. I could probably shut up now, but let me go on and try a few more jokes and see if we can make this a bit clearer. One of the things I'd like to do along the way here is to use Slido, and we'll just pop in the chat for those of you who don't want to use your camera. We'll just pop in the chat the link that you can follow. If I can make my cursor work. Nope, that's not it. You can certainly use, oh, there it is. You can certainly follow that QR code if you would like. If you prefer, in the chat, you will see a link to follow if you prefer to follow a link if you're using the same device. So I just want to ask you up front to give me a couple of examples of what are the sort of things that you're interested in, what concepts, what risk factors, exposures, predictors, or outcomes. What are the sorts of things that you're thinking about? I'd be very impressed if all 174 of you give me some answers, but maybe just a couple of people could have a go and just give me some things to work with. Have a go there, or 7 of you, that's fantastic. 10, wow, this is great. 16, pain versus patient satisfaction. Okay, learning outcomes. Okay, kindness, patient perception, quality of life. Oh, this is brilliant. Okay. Parent-child relationship quality. Right, chronic disease risk factors, children's voices. Okay, clinician confidence. Wow, these are all great ideas. And some of them are research capacity building, something right after my own heart. And so you've got PROMs there, big concepts like PROMs, big concepts like quality of care, staff satisfaction. Okay. Or getting CV fodder. I don't know if I understand what that means, but you guys have given some fantastic examples. Number of aggressive or violent incidents in an emergency department. That's a good example of something that's immediately countable, isn't it? But we do need to define it a bit. Okay, reduce suicides in the community. Benefits and harm versus induced labour. Great ideas, fantastic bits of research that you guys are working with. Some of these concepts that we're seeing are quite big and some of them are quite tightly defined. So a big concept that was on the screen a minute ago, let me just see if I can. Or is a clinic working? That's a big concept. We need to probably define that down. Wow. Everybody really got stuck into this. Thank you so much. I hope what you can see there is that some of these things are quite big ideas and they could be measured in lots of different ways. And those different ways might be encompass more of the concept or they might encompass less of the concept. And that's one of the challenges. Access equity. Wow, that's an important one. These are all, the digital space and loneliness. I see that in the chat. Oh, and risk of birth defects with medications. These are fantastic topics. Each one of them, I hope you can see a little bit of where you might need to work to pin down the questions. Now, some of that will be next week, but today, let's think about the concept. Okay, it looks like, one more person. Let's squeeze it in. The effectiveness of AI improving an EMR dataset. Wow. So, for example, what's effectiveness mean? What's AI? What's improving? Each of these things need to be thought through. Let me keep going then. Thank you very much for getting engaged. That was way more than I thought you would do. Can clinical supervision improve staff retention? Julie, I'd really like to do that study with you. I'm really thinking about a study like that. This is a bit too exciting for me. I better keep focused. Okay, why are we interested in measurement? Well, one of the biggest challenges we face in doing research is getting a big enough sample. And why is that an issue? Because we often don't have enough statistical power to answer the question that we want to answer. So having a big enough sample is really important for statistical power. And it's easier to say, recruit more people. Easy to say. Sometimes that's expensive, sometimes costly. By improving our measurement, we can also improve our statistical power. And that's one of the things we can do that's easier to do sometimes than to recruit more people. So just as another way around of saying it, Joe Fleece said in 1986, the most elegant design of a clinical study will not overcome the damage caused by unreliable or imprecise measurement. So getting the measurement right is one of those things that can really make our study a much more efficient and much more economical piece of work. So this graph here tries to illustrate how, I suppose that there's two features I want you to look at. First of all, if you look at the blue and green bars, now they represent different sample sizes. And I suppose one of the issues that I want you to see is that the blue and green bars are not very different. Yeah, generally speaking, there's not a lot of difference between the blue and green bars. But if you look at the difference between the internal consistency, and now that is a measure of the precision of a measurement tool, you can see that that makes a big difference between a tool that has Cronbach's alpha of 0.5 and a tool that has a Cronbach's alpha of 0.9. Makes a big difference on that graph in terms of the statistical power that you can have use to answer your question. So the story that I'm trying to tell you really is, and that graph and the simulation study that Heo did really makes this point. As a researcher, you can get much more efficiency and much a better study more easily by improving your measurement than you can by recruiting more people. That's one of the reasons why I think this is such an important thing for us to get right. Why I'm so keen to talk this through with you. Okay, so just some learning objectives. Look at some of the checklists for how do you do this critical appraisal? Where do you find the information? Things that we're not covering, not talking about constructing new instruments, not talking about how to do systematic reviews of measurement properties, won't really talk about screening tests or receiver operating characteristics. Those things are all deep dives if you want to go into those. They're interesting things, but we're not doing that today. So I'm going to make some assumptions. One of those is what is a correlation coefficient? And you can see the little picture there tells you a correlation is the relationship between two variables, and those variables are on and the X and Y axis. So a correlation of 1 is a perfect positive correlation. You can see pretty much there's a straight line here. A correlation that is high, 0.9, represents some deviation from that straight line. And as we get to lower correlations, we can see that there is less of a strong relationship between these two variables. And that's a positive correlation. Over here we have the negative correlations. So I also want to point out that a survey is a design, whereas a questionnaire is a method of gathering information that can be used in a survey or a clinical trial or any other design. Now, another thing that I think is worth us keeping in the back of our minds is when we assess something, one of the sorts of things that we want to be doing is going through this sort of hierarchy. Can we name it? Can we recognize the thing? That's one of the first steps in assessment. The next step is, can we sort it? Can we put it in order? Can we rank it? And the next step, which is often where we think we should be, is can we measure it? Can we assign numbers? Can we count how many of it there are? Perhaps the final assumption, and one of the biggest messages I want to get across today, is every time we measure something, we're going to be wrong. We're always going to be simplifying things. We're going to be trying to capture the complexity of the world in something a bit more simple. It's always going to be wrong. It's going to have error. And the issue is not, is it right or wrong? The issue is how wrong is it? How much error is there? We can't capture all of the variability that's out there in the world. We're trying to do justice to that variability, and we want to know how much error. So that's really why this is all exciting. I think that's the bit that makes me excited. So a bit of a joke there. We see the 3 pink bars in the graph, and you might know that they've got little error bars there, the little hats they've got. And the red one has a really large hat. And C is saying, I'm sorry, man, but we just can't trust you. So that bar graph, that bar for B has more variability in it. So the average that's represented by the height of the bar is less precise, less reliable. Maybe I've over-explained that joke. Let's keep going. Okay, let's just do a quick revision of some of the other sorts of measures. So let's just go back to some high school maths. High school science, I should say. It says science there, doesn't it? You might remember that we have a system of measurement that we generally tend to use. It's the System International, SI, and these are the SI units. You might remember that there are 7 base units: seconds, meters, kilograms, amperes, kelvins, moles, and candelas. Those are the base units from which 22 derived units can be generated, and they can include things like joules, watts, frequency, resistance. We've probably got some dietitians in the audience who are good at counting kilojoules. I'm sure we've got physios who do 6-minute walk tests, where we're measuring distance. Oftentimes we are talking about measuring these kind of concepts, but oftentimes there's a bit of a mixture. So for example, if we look at this, a sample of 58 consecutive referrals to a tertiary podiatry clinic was recruited. 139 or 54% were female, 201 or 78% had onset of diabetes more than 10 years before referral. Average BMI was 29.56 with a standard deviation of 10.3. So in that paragraph, we've got a mixture of some of these standard units, haven't we? We've got a count of consecutive referrals. So a number of patients is not one of the SI units. We've got 139 were female. Well, gender or sex at birth, I don't know, they haven't specified which one of these it is not a concept that's there in SI. It's a concept that we often try to measure. And again, that's something we could think about how we operationalize that. Oftentimes we ask people. Then we've got 201 had onset of diabetes more than 10 years before referral. So okay, 10 years is just a derivative of seconds. So there we are, the first of the SI base units. We've used that. But we've got to count 201. Then we've got average BMI. And I'm sure most of you know that BMI has got something to do with height and weight. And both of those things are height in meters, weight in kilograms. So BMI is a derivative unit from SI. Go us. We've done measuring. Now, one of the points I want to make here is oftentimes we're not directly, we are using those kinds of units, but oftentimes we're using other kinds of units. The examples you guys gave included things like quality of life. Quality of life doesn't have a definition in SI. So we need to work out how we define quality of life. We need to work out what's the best way to measure that. Another way to think about measurement error, you probably did this in high school again, was we can think about parallax error when you read off a scale. And we can think about, when we're using things like a ruler, that measurement error is half the smallest graduation on the scale. So those ideas might have been things that you definitely had back in high school. But what about error when we come to a quality of life measure? What does that mean? What does that mean? Okay, so that's sort of giving us a sense of the big questions we want to try to answer. What are the frameworks that you can use? Now, a bit of an apology to those of you who aren't in New South Wales, because I've picked the Agency for Clinical Innovation Analytic Principles for Patient-Reported Outcome Measures. So how is it that ACI thinks we should choose patient-recorded outcome measures? They think we should look at these concepts that are here. We should do a conceptual analysis. The construct to be measured by the tool is clearly stated. Well, I guess in addition, and it matches what you want is an important one. Reliability. So this is our precision. The tool yields the same estimate when it's administered, all other things being equal. It might consider the internal consistency. The questions ask the same thing, and it's consistent over time. We talk about validity, and validity and the concept are kind of related. There are different sorts of validity we might pay attention to. It's responsive. So up here we talked about test-retest reliability. It doesn't change when it shouldn't change. And down here we've got it changes when it should change. It's interpretable. It's straightforward and easy to use. It's available in the mode of administration you want. And there are language, gender, age, literacy level kinds of issues here. So we could think of some of these ones in blue as, or light blue, as the sort of technical evaluation, and the following issues as practical questions. But we can use this framework to help us choose. Another framework that you might come across, which is very useful, is the COSMIN. So it's the consensus-based standards for the selection of health measurement instruments. And there's a website there, which is a great resource to go on with if you're interested in this. It's really useful because it does give you a search tool, and it gives you pre-appraised assessments of different measurements in different areas. So if you want to look for information about how to measure something, looking on COSMIN is a good idea. So what does COSMIN include? It includes some of the validity questions. Is this thing that we're talking about measuring the idea that we want it to measure? And it talks about the internal consistency. So is it generally speaking that the questions that make up the tool are answering the same construct? A couple of other sorts of issues there. Responsiveness, there's a reliable translation process. So it doesn't perhaps give as much weight to the practical issues there as the ACI framework. You could use both these frameworks. They're both suitable and to help you make a judgment. So what do we do practically when we want to do this kind of thing? So I want to take you through some steps. What is it that you want to assess? What's the design brief for it? What are the constraints? What are the alternatives? Now, you might need a scoping review. You might find that someone else has already done a scoping review. A good place to find one of those is to look on the COSMIN website. You might commission one, you might do one. But the basic question there is, if you're interested in one of these concepts, what have other people done? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. In a little while, I'll show you some search strategy for finding that kind of information, and talk a little bit about doing critical appraisal there. But usually what we're talking about is coming up with some sort of a table where we put the alternatives down and we list out, is it conceptually strong? Has the technical issues, are they strong? What about the practical issues? Now, this information that I've got here is from a very out-of-date review of screening for depression in cardiac settings. And at that point in time, it looked like the choice was to use the PHQ for a variety of reasons. It helps us to make that kind of decision. That's the kind of thing I think we want to head towards as a practical outcome from today. So let's just dwell a bit on the conceptual issues. I've got Cousin It here to help us. One of the hardest things to get right is to get the concept right. Can you name it? And one of the tasks that I think is often worth doing is, what's its nearest neighbor? What's the close thing that you're talking about that's not the thing you're interested in? So oftentimes people say quality of life. And if you asked what's a concept that's near quality of life that you don't want, and it might be health functioning, global functioning, maybe a concept that's like quality of life, but it's not quality of life. Okay, can you sort it? Can you say this person has more of that thing than this other person? Can you put it in order? Can you say things like this person's mobility is greater than that person's mobility, if we pick mobility as the concept? Can you measure it then? Is there a ruler? Is there some way to assess that? So is this person 165 centimeters tall, for example? So that process, I think, is a sort of mental process, and I think an important kind of desk audit almost. Can you define it? Can you define what it isn't? I think I'd spend a bit more time, if you would, on defining what it isn't. One of our big challenges then is, can you directly see it? Can you directly observe it? Or is it a latent variable? So for example, you can observe height. You can get out a ruler and you can see against the ruler how high someone is. Can you observe socioeconomic status, for example? There may be signs of socioeconomic status. So maybe wearing a trucker cap might be a sign of socioeconomic status. Wearing a suit might be a sign of socioeconomic status. But it isn't in itself socioeconomic status. Perhaps we're talking about say, for example, a difference between crying during appointments. We can observe that versus depression, something we can't observe, but we think exists. Maybe mobility, for example, is a bigger concept, and what we can measure, what we can directly observe is, say, for example, something like distance on a 6-minute walk test. And you can see when we're talking about this issue that these concepts are not completely overlapping. People might cry during appointments for all sorts of reasons that are not to do with their depression. Someone might go a further distance on a 6-minute walk test for factors that are not mobility. They're not completely overlapping. And therein lies one of our questions, one of our dilemmas. Another issue I'd like you to think about is something that seems obvious. It seems obvious to say, how far is it around Australia? So you can start out by saying, well, if you went in a boat, probably about 1,400 kilometres, 14,000 kilometres. In fact, if you went around Highway 1 on the road, that is about 14,500. But what about if you went around Australia by kayak and you went around every headland and every cove? Well, the distance would be further. And then if you decided, actually, I'm going to trace the distance around every grain of sand. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that what's the level of precision that's required to answer your question? Most of you will probably say, this is absurd. It's clearly the distance around Australia is 14,000 kilometres. It's not an infinite distance. It's not of any practical use to know about what the distance is around every grain of sand. But again, here comes a bad joke. You think we're doing this for fun? I'm trying to collide particles fast enough to find the Higgs boson. My God, man, what kind of idiots do you think we are? And you can see the knights jousting. For those of you who, and of course, like every bad dad joke, this one requires an explanation. A boson is a subatomic particle. I hope that gave you a little chuckle. Sometimes it's going to help to do a mind map or a concept map to help you with this, what we call operationalization, turning this concept into a measure. So this, for example, is a picture of a mind map. The resolution's not very high, I apologize, but the paper is there if you want to look up the original. And this is talking about the concept of integrated care, an important concept, really something we aspire to in health. But what does integrated care mean and how do we measure it? So I've just used a red arrow there to point out that one thing that you might be able to use is there may be some indicators in the EMR which might give you an indicator of what integrated care was for individuals. It might also be the case, and you can probably see at different points in the picture, that interviewing people about what they thought of their care might give you an indication of integrated care. What's the best one for you to choose? I don't know. What's the best way to choose? I think it's best to get to really make sure that you know what you mean by integrated care before you try to look for a measure. So as an example, you might find that mind mapping is a way to help you to move ahead with taking the idea that you've got and turning it into something to measure. Okay, so many of the things that we're interested in are these things that we can't directly observe. They're latent constructs. And we can usually get a measure of them by triangulating, by putting a number of observed variables together. We add those up, and then that sum becomes an estimate of the thing. Now, a deeper dive here is to consider, in that picture, you can see the latent variable. The arrows go from the latent variable to the observed. So in other words, the thing we can't see causes the person to answer the questions in a particular way. Depression causes the person to answer the question about how often do you cry in a particular way. That's called a formative indicator. Really deep dive if you're interested in it. When we come to measures of things like socioeconomic status, we don't think socioeconomic status causes your education level, for example. Education level is sorry, I've got this round the wrong way. I just said it the wrong way. The picture is of reflective indicators, causal or formative indicators of what we have when we're talking about socioeconomic status, for example. Right. The challenge we have is, can we add things up? Now, obviously, if we put apples and oranges together, what do we get? Well, simple answer is to say we get fruit. It's all right if you're going to count fruit. But if you're interested in appleness, what does it mean to count oranges in there as well? So one of the things we can get wrong is that when we take a measure, it doesn't capture the whole concept. Now, there are a couple of good examples of that. I'd like to remind you of the Cobra effect. Now, you might remember the story of the Cobra effect in colonial rule of India. The British were upset by the number of poisonings from cobras, or sorry, but venomous bites. I get the poison versus venom wrong. And so they set out to reduce the cobra population. So they set up a bounty where people could they could get some money for bringing in a dead cobra. Now, what happened is that enterprising people started to farm cobras and then killed them and brought them in. Then the British got word of this and decided to stop the bounty. And then what did all the people who set up cobra farms do? They let the cobras go. So the net effect of all of this in the story is that there are more cobras around in the community. Now, many people tell that story as a way of talking about setting up the wrong indicator. And what we can think about it is that the choice of dead cobra as the indicator, as the measure, was the wrong measure. It didn't cover the whole concept. What we needed to do was have a bounty only for wild cobras. Now, how would you do that? I am not sure. So this illustrates one of the problems. This is an example of what's called mono-operation bias. We have a concept and we haven't completely mapped it into the measure. I'm sure that if we think about this, each of you would come up with really good examples in your own health system of where a very complex concept is being assessed on a dashboard in a way that doesn't capture the whole thing. We never do that in Sydney Local Health District. So you guys gave me an idea of some of the measures that you were thinking about, some of the different ways. And I'm just wondering if some of you, perhaps not as many as last time, but some of you want to jump in and say, when you had a more complex construct, what are some of the ways that you think you can turn that into a measure? Somebody who had quality of life as a construct they were interested to measure. Let's see, maybe even yes, so that's the Slido again in the chat if you want it. Maybe even one of you who are talking about what's your indicator of staff retention, for example, or how do you know, what are the ideas for or turning loneliness into a construct as something that you could measure? Okay, so SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-based, good. Okay, diagnose the problem. Define retention. Okay, so any ideas about how you could define retention? So it could be that there's a question, for example, in the People Matters survey about people's intention for how long they're going to stay in the agency. That would be one way you could pick that question out of People Matters. It's not. You could also then do a follow-up and say, okay, over time, and of course that using People Matters would have a number of issues. Review the exit survey, okay, and are some people so pissed off they don't do the exit survey? Would be something to consider. Ooh. I want to measure an autonomic state as a measure of patient's sense of safety in real time. Wow, that's a cool one. Okay, so autonomic state as a measure of safety. Yeah, and I guess that's an interesting one because there's a long, just in terms of that particular question, there's a long-standing work that goes back to a researcher called Peter Lang in the 1960s, showing that the correlation between people's subjective experience, their autonomic function, and their behavior, so they don't match up terribly well. Break down into small, easy to digest pieces. Not a bad strategy. Okay, let's just see. Break quality of life up into subdomains. Okay, pain level or mental health. Right. Okay, using pre-existing tools such as the UCLA 3-item loneliness scale. I would spend a bit of time just checking that 3-item loneliness scale captured as much of the concept of loneliness that you wanted. It's a good idea. Many people use that 3-item loneliness scale. Yeah, pre-test and ask for feedback. Okay, so you guys are coming up with really practical ways to do this. Guess I'd challenge you a little bit. Okay, CCI panel, people with lived experience will define the construct. Neat. Okay, so how do people who have lived experience define the construct? That's a really neat way to go. Good. Okay, let me keep going then. That sounds like that's given us some good material to work with. Okay, so what we're talking about then is some of the technical evaluation. Is it reliable? So internal consistency means that if you have, say, a questionnaire of quality of life and you're adding up the different questions in that questionnaire, that the different questions correlate with each other. They are, generally speaking, if you answer a high level on one, you are generally likely to answer high on another one. Test-retest reliability generally is talking about do those scores remain stable over time when they're not supposed to change. Inter-rater reliability is really appropriate for where there's clinical judgment. So do two raters make the same judgment? Do two clinicians come up with the same diagnosis? Would be a way of assessing that. Now, the validity issue here is one where we're talking about trying to get a handle on, as we said, we don't always know what the target is. So when we're talking about validity, we've always got this challenge of what's this whole concept? And usually the way we do this is we come up with what are the other indicators of that concept. So criterion validity is where we've got a very strong indicator of that underlying concept. That's a key indicator. Construct validity is where we don't have such a strong indicator of that underlying construct, and we're trying to then say this should be related to this stuff and it shouldn't be related to this stuff. I won't talk about incremental validity, and then I think we would also want things to be sensitive to change if we were trying to measure change. So again, a deeper dive would be to think about causal or formative indicators, but that's a really a bit more of an abstract question for you. Okay, the practical evaluation. Is it accessible? Do you get it already? Is some of these things that we're talking about are already available in Hope in New South Wales? I apologise. I'm not sure how the Queensland systems work. Maybe it's a question of can you get it out of Hope? One of the things about Hope, I guess you probably noticed, is that not always is the response rate good. Not everybody fills out the questionnaires in Hope, and particularly perhaps post-treatment, they might be a little lower on the completion. Does it require training? Is it complex to score? How long does it take the person to complete it? If you're in a busy outpatient clinic, you're not likely to be able to get a whole hour of questionnaires done by your patients. What level of reading does it require? We're really aiming for things to be at about grade 7 reading level for the general population. And in different contexts, you might ask for something a bit lower. Is it available in community languages? Is there existing data, or how much of that existing data is missing, particularly if we're picking up data that's collected for other reasons? Are there norms or reference points or values that are relevant to your population? But in making this kind of judgment, you only need to be as good as or a little better than the last person. Perfect may be unattainable. Okay, it also might be a question of choosing the least worst option. Put it all together in a table. Now, just to illustrate this, what do we mean here when I was talking about what's the best tool to screen for depression in cardiac settings? You know, someone's had a heart attack. They're often feeling pretty like they've been through the ringer. It's reasonable to have the emotion of depression in that context. Does that require treatment? What we're interested here is depression, meaning a major depressive disorder that is likely to benefit from treatment. So in a way, this screening tool is trying to identify, should we be doing something more for these people? We often can get lost in that, in this kind of context, as are they depressed? That's not really the question. The question is, do they need some extra help? So that's really what the screening tool is trying to be able to achieve. And it's important to kind of pin that down in the construct before we go jumping into the measures. But as I say, this is a bit out of date, and I just want to pick up that as an example. So I've talked to you about the theoretical stuff. How do we do this practically? And then I better speed up a little bit so we've got a bit of time to talk about things. The COSMIN database is really useful because it will give you systematic reviews of different measures. And then some of the OVID tools have in them a particular tests and measures field that you can use. So let me show that. So the COSMIN database, for example, now I've gone in there, database.cosmin.nl. You can see it's actually in the Netherlands. And I've put in depression medical because I'm interested in in depression in medical systems, medical contexts. And you can see that it hit 121, and some of those are kind of useful. So here we got a systematic review of depression and anxiety measures used in individuals with spinal cord injury. You have a few other things you can do to limit that search, but I think if you're looking for how to measure something, the COSMIN database is quite useful, and you can get access to these existing reviews. If you can't find them, if you clicked on that and it didn't actually take you to the source material, your local librarian would be able to help you with that. Hopefully you've worked out that being in research means that you make friends with your librarian. If you're using an Ovid search tool, again, this might be something for a librarian to help you with, but you can see in Ovid there's a thing called search fields, and one of the things you can tick is tests and measures. So if you're interested in a particular way of assessing something, you can use the Ovid search tools to find research that have used that measure. But again, if that's sounding a bit too over the top, make friends with your librarian to help you with that. So here's a list of resources that might find useful to help you to do these things. I particularly really point out that the sort of book-length treatments were the Duet and the Striner and Norman are the really classical books on how to make, if you want to read some more. This one from Robin Tate in the Raw Ride Rehab team looks at comparing COSMIN with others in order to make assessments. If you're interested in implementation science and implementation measures, this paper by Lewis is quite interesting. And then I've put in a few references there that show how having better measurement gives you more statistical power and is an efficient way to improve your research design. So just to come back then, this is the overall point that overall message I wanted to get through to you. Can we define the target? Can we think about the concept first? And then we're thinking about how much our measure captures of that concept, and then how consistently it does it. So is it reliable? Is it valid? Those are the two issues. And I think, could I just ask you then, and we can move into some questions, what do you feel like at the moment is the most useful thing that you've taken from this presentation? Just give me a little bit of feedback. Or if you want to go on to starting to ask questions. Yeah, COSMIN, cool. If I've given you one thing, have a look at COSMIN. Yep, resources, thank you. Yeah, and I think I would really stress spending time defining what you want to measure. Right. Good, thank you. It looks like in terms of me getting an indicator of have I got across the message I want to get across, this is a good measure of that. Yeah, think more about questionnaires, even if they are validated. What does validated mean? And is it helping you? Where can you get a recording? I think that Kimberly will help us with that. Excellent dad jokes. That's cool. Okay, so perhaps we can move. I'll take that slide down in a minute. It looks like anyone else want to share? That's 18 people's really good feedback. I'll take that slide down, but thank you for that. And yeah, can I answer any questions for you?
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. That was really fantastic, and I think it's really helpful. Something I was reflecting on with those diagrams that you came back to at the end about being reliable and accurate. It reminds me of something we'd try and drill into students when I was teaching at the uni, that can be completely precise but completely inaccurate at the same time. So it's a variation on a theme, and seeing those diagrams is really helpful. It's a simple concept, but I think really worthwhile, being reminded about how you measure things as well. So that's great feedback. I think everyone's taken away the COSMIN database, which was also something that I didn't know about either. So I've
Yeah.
learned something as well.
And if that's helpful, and if you feel a bit more like you want a deeper dive, the textbook by DeVet is one of the authors of the COSMIN database. So that textbook is a really great resource. I am hoping it might be in your hospital libraries or a library and a health service, but if not, there might be an ebook somewhere.
Yeah, and look, while we're just talking about this, as everyone would see, there's a survey. We would love to know what you thought about this. So we've already had some great responses, but this helps us collect feedback in a systematic way for RR-CLaN. Alex pops the link for that in the chat. Otherwise, we do have a QR code. There's been actually no additional questions appear in the chat either, Andrew. So perhaps we take the last couple of minutes. If anyone does want to unmute themselves and ask a question, we'd certainly be open
Did I
to that.
see someone put their hand up a minute ago? They
I
seem
see
to have
one.
gone down now. Anyway.
Yeah. Does anyone have any? Oh, here we go. So Jack has said, how can you bridge the gap between a research construct and how it is practically measured, particularly for
Yes.
latent variables?
Well, if you're thinking about a particular, Jack, do you want to say what the concept is that you've got in mind? I'm sure we can have a go at it. And in fact, that's exactly it. That's the whole exercise, and knowing how well we've captured that concept. So we might, for practical reasons, say use that UCLA 3-item question on loneliness, and that might be quite a practical way to ask about loneliness. But thinking through what is the experience of loneliness in all of its depths, and how well, what proportion of that big construct does those three questions do conceptually, as well as reliability wise. But Jack, if you've got an example, very happy to see if we can help.
Otherwise, we are on 3:59. So I wonder if in the app I'll take oh, Jack's maybe he can't access a microphone. I'm doing research in sports science on the effect of development environments in an athlete's birthplace on long-term performance outcomes. So a little left field.
Oh, and those kinds of things might be, say, for example, you had an athlete that was born in a war zone. That sort of thing you mean, or an athlete that lived in a very socioeconomically deprived context when they were born? Those kind of things you could think through. How do you think, what's the mechanism there? How do we think we might pin that down? It would be perhaps, take that example maybe and bring it to Steve next week, and not next week, next time, and see how you pin down that as a question, and then maybe looking at each of the constructs you want to work on. I could think of all sorts of interesting questions there.
Yeah, and he said more regional and remote. But I wonder if perhaps I'll take this opportunity to thank Andrew and thank people starting to leave. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and Andrew for a wonderful presentation. Perhaps Alex, we might stop the recording, and if people do want to say something but don't want to be in the recording, they might feel a little better doing that.